The dust on Dura's IV was red, not the kind of red that looked beautiful at sunset, but the kind that stuck to your teeth and crept into your lungs and reminded you, constantly, that this planet had never wanted anyone to be here. Darian Cole didn't care. He was on his knees in the dirt, brushing sand off a section of wall that had no business existing. 3 hours into the quarantine, the food dispensers in the research quarters stopped working. It was probably not intentional. The dispensers ran on the same power grid as the external comm relays, and when the collective security team cut the outgoing signal bandwidth, it tripped a circuit that nobody had thought to check. Darian figured this out in about 20 minutes by tracing the cable routing himself. He fixed it with a piece of wire and a clip from his field kit, and then made himself a cup of hot broth and sat down at his desk and started thinking. The quarantine was a message. He understood that. When an organization as large and old as the Interstellar Collective moved fast, it meant something had scared them. They did not scare easily. He had spent enough time at collective academic conferences to know that the dominant mood of every species in that alliance was a calm, settled certainty that they had seen most things the galaxy had to offer. They were not arrogant about it exactly. They were simply experienced. Humans with 80 years of membership were still considered new, still considered small. Whatever was behind that vault door, it had made Orin call for a security lockdown within an hour of seeing the spiral symbol. Darian unfolded the rubbing and laid it flat on his desk. He put a light behind it. The spiral looked back at him, patient and precise. He opened his offline research archive, the one stored on a local drive, not connected to any network, and began going through his own notes from 3 years ago when he had first started putting together the proposal for the Dura's IV dig. He found the photograph. Southern France. Chauvet-adjacent cave system, catalogued but not widely studied. The spiral on the cave wall was in a section that predated the main paintings by several thousand years. The researchers who documented it had noted the unusual precision of the line and then moved on, because there were more interesting things in the cave and one spiral was not a paper on its own. Darian placed the rubbing next to the photograph on his screen. The ratio was identical, not similar, identical to 4 decimal places. He was still looking at this when Una knocked and came in without waiting, which was how she always entered rooms. "They took all our site data," she said. "The whole local server. They walked in with a portable drive, copied everything, and left." "I know. They also told me that our scheduled supply drop next week has been delayed." She sat down on the edge of his bunk. "Delayed, not canceled, which means they haven't decided what to do with us yet." "They won't hurt us," Darian said. "We're human researchers on a collective-funded project. If we disappear, Earth asks questions." That's comforting in a very specific way. He turned the screen so she could see both images. She looked at them for a long time without speaking, which was unusual for Una. "That's the same," she said finally. "Yes. That's from Earth." "Yes." She looked up at him. "Do you have your offline comparative archive, the full one?" He did. He passed her his secondary unit and she started working. He went back to the rubbing. Outside, through the small reinforced window of the quarters block, he could see 2 collective security personnel standing near the dig site entrance. They were not in combat gear. This was not a military operation. It was an administrative one, which in some ways was worse. Military operations ended. Administrative ones could last for years. He was considering this when the door at the end of the corridor opened, and a human face appeared. Lieutenant Bren was not what he looked like. He looked like a perfectly ordinary young officer in the Earth Survey Vessel crew uniform, tidy and unremarkable, the kind of person who handed out schedules and confirmed docking clearances. He was, in fact, one of Admiral Voss's better intelligence assets, which was why she sent him down when the diplomatic situation needed someone who could think quickly and carry things in unusual places. He came in, closed the door, and handed Darien a flat case the size of a credit chip. "Admiral Voss sends her greetings," he said. "She also says, and I'm quoting, that if you have anything you don't want the collective to keep, now would be a good time to give it to me. The Admiral is in orbit. The Relentless has been in this system for 6 days. Standard survey rotation. The quarantine order came in this morning, and the Admiral decided not to move the ship. The collective asked her to. Counselor Rail asked her to personally on a priority channel." Bren smiled slightly. The Admiral acknowledged the request. Darien understood. Acknowledging a request was not complying with one. He looked at the case Bren had given him. It was a data chip sleeve, military grade, with a physical encryption lock. Yuna looked up from her work. "Darien, come here." He went. She had pulled up her offline comparative archive, a personal database she had built over 7 years of xenoarchaeology study that cross-referenced structural patterns in ancient art and writing systems across 40 species. She had run the spiral symbol through it. The symbol appeared 16 times in the archive. Every single match was from Earth. Indus Valley Civilization, Pre-Sumerian Mesopotamia, the Nazca Plateau, the Tiwanaku site in South America, megalithic structures in Malta, early Neolithic carvings in Ireland. All of them used the same symbol with the same specific proportions across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers of human history on a single planet. And now here it was, carved into a door on a dead world 400,000 years before any of those civilizations existed. Yuna's voice was very quiet. Either someone visited Earth repeatedly across the entire span of human prehistory, she said, or the people who built this place and the people who drew these symbols on Earth there connected at the source. Darien picked up Bren's data chip sleeve. "Can you get a full data package to the Relentless?" he asked. Bren nodded, without Oren seeing it leave. Bren smiled again, more fully this time. "That's why the Admiral sent me instead of a message." Darien began compiling the package. Everything. The photographs, the measurements, the dating results, Yuna's comparative archive, his own notes, and the rubbing of the spiral. He copied it to the chip and handed it to Bren, who tucked it somewhere inside his uniform without breaking eye contact. "Tell the Admiral," Darien said. "Tell her this is the kind of thing that doesn't get buried." Bren left as quietly as he had arrived. Outside, the 2 collective security personnel changed shifts. Neither of them had noticed anything at all. Nobody asked Darien to open the door. That was the part that bothered him most about it afterward. The collective science team arrived on the 2nd day of the quarantine. 6 specialists in xenotechnology, materials analysis, and ancient structures, flown in on a fast courier ship that must have been dispatched almost immediately after Oren's first transmission. They were professional and they were thorough, and they spent 14 hours trying to open the vault door by every method available to collective science, which was considerable. Sonic resonance tools, molecular bond readers, thermal expansion probes, a piece of equipment that Darien didn't recognize and that nobody explained, which emitted a low hum for 2 hours and then went silent. Nothing happened. The door stayed closed. On the morning of the 3rd day, Oren came to Darien's quarters. He stood in the doorway and was quiet for a long moment, which seemed to be a thing he did when he was trying to decide how to say something he didn't want to say. "We would like your assistance," Oren said finally. Darien was eating breakfast. He took another bite before answering. "With what?" "The primary access point. Our team has been unable to establish an interface." "You mean the door won't open?" "Correct." Darien set down his cup. "And you think I can do something your 6 specialists can't?" Oren's expression didn't change. "The door responded when you were near it, during the initial uncovering. Our sensor logs show a faint energy signature that matched your approach. It has not responded to anyone else." Darien had not told anyone about that. He had been careful not to react when it happened, that brief flicker of something. Like a change in air pressure, when he had first cleared the last layer of sediment from the vault door and leaned in close to look at the spiral symbol. He had filed it away and said nothing. The fact that Orin knew about it from sensor logs told him the site had been under significantly more surveillance than was standard for an academic dig. "I'll need my full kit," Darian said, "and Yuna." Orin agreed without negotiating, which told Darian how badly they wanted the door open. They descended into the deep chamber with 6 collective specialists, 4 security personnel, and Orin. Darian walked at a normal pace and tried not to think too much. Thinking too much before an unknown situation had always made him less useful, not more. Yuna walked beside him and said nothing, which was how he knew she was nervous. The chamber looked the same. The vault door stood at the far end, pale and sealed and patient. The spiral symbol caught the light of their portable lamps and threw a faint shadow that moved as they moved. Darian walked up to it. He stopped about a meter away. He looked at the spiral for a moment. Then he reached out and pressed his palm flat against the door, just to the left of the symbol, the way you might put your hand on a wall to feel if there was heat behind it. The door opened. Not dramatically. It didn't swing. It didn't grind or shudder. It simply became not a door. The material retracted in a smooth movement in all directions, folding away into the frame in less than 2 seconds, leaving an opening 3 meters wide and 4 meters tall. No sound, no dust, no smell. Air moved through from the other side, and it was clean air, processed and steady, which meant the space beyond had been sealed and maintained for a very long time. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Darian stepped through the door. The chamber on the other side was smaller than the one behind them, circular. The walls curved up into a dome overhead. In the center of the room, sitting on a low platform made of the same unknown material as everything else in the structure, was a shape. It was roughly cylindrical, about the height of a person, and it was not mechanical in any way that Darian could categorize. It had no visible seams, no panels, no input surfaces. It simply sat there, and the air around it had a faint quality that made the lamplight behave slightly differently, as if the space itself was paying attention. Then it spoke. Darian had spent 19 years working across multiple species and learning enough of 3 alien languages to be functional. He knew what alien language sounded like. He knew the particular way non-human phonetics arranged themselves. This was not that. The sounds coming from the object were human. Not a language he spoke, not a language anyone alive spoke, but the structure of the sounds, the way syllables were shaped and spaced and weighted, was unmistakably from the same root system that had produced every language on Earth. He caught fragments, a pattern that his brain kept trying to match to something, the way you hear a melody in a new song that sounds like one you learned as a child but can't quite name. He understood 3 words with certainty. The rest were fog. The 3 words were, wait, return, and begin. Behind him, the collective specialists were silent. Orin had his recorder running. Yuna was very still at Darian's shoulder, and he could feel that she was holding her breath. He turned slightly and saw that Grath was there. He hadn't noticed the Veth elder arrive. Grath was very old, even by Veth standards, with a face that looked like weathered bark and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised easily. He was the senior collective representative for the Outer Rim territories, and he had traveled a long way to be here, which meant he had been coming before the door even opened. Grath was looking at the object. His expression was the first thing Darian had ever seen genuinely shake the old alien's composure. It was not fear, exactly. It was something worse than fear. It was recognition. Darian turned back to the object and tried his best. "We're here," he said, feeling somewhat foolish. "We came back." The object went very still. Then the air in the room changed again, and it said something longer, a full sentence in that root of all human languages, and Darian caught most of it this time because it was speaking more slowly now, more carefully, the way you speak to someone who understands you but needs time. He turned to the room. "It says," he said, and paused to make sure he had it right. "It says, the Cedars have returned. The cycle is complete. We have been waiting." He looked at Orin. Orin's recorder was still running, but his hand had gone slack at his side. Darian looked at Grath. Grath closed his eyes. "What are the Cedars?" Darian asked the object. The room was completely silent. Even the recycled air seemed to stop. The object answered in 2 words, the clearest it had spoken yet. Darian stood with those 2 words sitting in his chest like stones, warm and heavy and impossible, and he understood then why Orin had called for the lockdown. He understood why Grath had come all this way. He understood why his transmission to Earth had been blocked. He turned to face the room full of alien faces staring at him, and said it out loud so there was no confusion. "It says we are." He had been an archaeologist for 19 years. He had worked on 11 planets. He had found old things before tools, bones, the collapsed shells of buildings that crumbled when you breathed on them. This was different. This wall didn't crumble. This wall, buried under 40 meters of rock and sediment that took 3 years to excavate, looked like it had been built yesterday. The material wasn't stone. It wasn't metal. It wasn't anything in any database Darian had access to. And he had access to every database the Interstellar Collective had shared with humanity since first contact 80 years ago. "You're doing that thing again," said Una from behind him. Darian didn't look up. "What thing?" "The quiet thing. The thing where you go completely still and your eyes get small, and I know you found something that's going to make the next 6 months extremely complicated." He sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath. "Come look at this." Una crouched beside him. She was 26, 12 years younger than Darian, and she had a habit of being right about things before he was ready to admit it. She looked at the wall. She looked at the section he had been clearing. Her expression went through several changes very quickly. "Those markings," she said. "Yes. They look like. I know what they look like." She turned to him. "But they can't." "I know." The markings were cut into the surface of the wall with a precision that no hand tool could have managed. They were arranged in rows, left to right, with clear spacing between groups. They had an internal structure, a logic. Darian had spent enough time studying ancient human writing systems to recognize that logic, even when he was seeing it somewhere it could not possibly be. This was not a human site. This ruin was older than humanity's first cities by a factor of several hundred. By every dating method they had used, the structure beneath Duraziv was approximately 400,000 years old. Humans had been drawing symbols on cave walls for only 50,000 years. And yet, he photographed every centimeter of the section. He tagged each marking in the field log. He cross-referenced the patterns against the offline databases he carried on his personal unit. No matches in the collective archive. But something kept pulling at the edge of his mind, a feeling like recognizing a word in a language you half forgot. He did not mention this to the collective observer standing 20 meters behind him. The observer's name was Orin. He was collective standard in most ways, tall, pale-skinned, with the careful stillness that most non-human species seem to adopt when they were in the presence of humans doing things. He had been assigned to the dig 8 months ago, which was normal. Every dig site that received collective funding had a collective observer. It was called academic cooperation. Darian called it something else privately. Orin had been quiet all morning. He was not quiet now. "Researcher Cole," his voice was even, "I will need the imaging data from this section before end of day." Darian kept his eyes on the wall. "You'll get it when I've finished the initial documentation. Same as every other section." "This section is different." "Every section is different. That's archaeology." Orin didn't answer. Darien heard the sound of a comm unit being activated behind him. He didn't turn around. They had reached the deepest accessible chamber the week before. It had taken 3 months of careful excavation just to clear the passage leading down to it. The chamber was large, roughly the size of a city block, with a ceiling so high that their portable lights didn't reach it. The walls were covered in the same impossible material as the rest of the structure. The floor was clean. No debris, no collapse, no decay of any kind. At the far end of the chamber was a door. Calling it a door was the only word that made sense, even though it didn't fully fit. It was a section of the wall that was clearly separate from the rest. The seam around it was perfect. The surface was different, smoother, with a faint quality to it that their lights caught at certain angles. And in the center of it, carved with the same inhuman precision as the markings on the outer walls, was a single symbol. A spiral. Darien had stared at it for a long time when they first uncovered it. He had taken dozens of photographs. He had said nothing to anyone about what he noticed. The spiral was not abstract, it was specific. It had a particular ratio in the spacing of its turns, a particular way the line thickened and thinned. He had seen this exact spiral before, not on another planet, not in any alien archive. In a photograph from a cave in southern France on Earth, a cave that was 30,000 years old. He sent a full report to Earth that evening, encrypted and flagged urgent. He included the photographs, the measurements, the dating results, and a note that simply said, "I think we need to talk about this before the collective sees it." The transmission went out at 2100 hours. He checked his system at 2300 hours and found no confirmation of receipt. He checked again at 600 the next morning, nothing. When he walked out of his quarters, he found 2 collective security personnel standing in the corridor. They were polite. They told him the dig site was under a temporary quarantine. They told him it was routine. They told him his research data was being secured for processing. Darien looked at them for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and felt the paper rubbing he had made of the spiral symbol the night before, pressed flat between 2 sheets of wax paper, tucked behind his field notebook. "Of course," he said, "very routine." He smiled and said nothing else. The thing about very old secrets is that they are heavy, not in a poetic sense, in a practical one. The people who carry them change shape under the weight. They develop habits of deflection, layers of justification, whole architectures of belief built to hold the secret steady and keep it from pressing too hard against the parts of themselves that know better. Grath had been carrying this one for a very long time. He didn't say anything in the chamber. He stood with his eyes closed for nearly a full minute while Darien repeated what the archivist, as Darien had already started thinking of it, had said. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Oren, and something passed between them that was not a conversation but was not nothing either. Then Grath said, "We should move this discussion." Darien said, "We're not moving anywhere." It was the first time he had said something directly contrary to a collective representative's suggestion, in 12 years of working on collective-funded projects, without softening it afterward. He did not soften it now. He stood in the circular chamber with the archivist humming gently behind him, and he looked at Grath and he waited. Grath looked at him for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he nodded. It took 4 hours to get the full account. Darien translated, speaking in fragments and then correcting himself when the archivist clarified, while Una wrote everything down by hand in her field notebook, because neither of them trusted any recording device in the room. The collective specialists stood in a ring around the outside. Oren stood slightly apart. Grath stood close, and he listened with an expression that a human would have called grief. This is what the archivist said. 500,000 years ago, there was a civilization that called itself the Kale. They were the first species in this region of the galaxy to develop faster-than-light travel. They were the first to map the stars. They were the first to make contact with other intelligent life, and they were also, by a significant margin, the most powerful force the galaxy had ever produced. They used that power. For a long time, they used it freely, the way any species uses what it has to survive, to grow, to win. They built networks across star systems. They reshaped planets. They made decisions on behalf of other species because it was easier, because they were better equipped, because the reasoning always made sense when you looked at it from the position of a civilization that had never lost. Then they watched a world burn. One of the species they had been managing, a small civilization on a quiet planet they had mostly ignored, had been quietly developing under the Kale's incomplete attention. By the time the Kale noticed, the species had reached a level of technology that made them dangerous, and they were also angry, for reasons that took the Kale researchers a long time to understand, and that the Kale leadership dismissed for even longer. The war that followed lasted 200 years. It ended when the Kale won. It ended with the other species gone. And in the silence after, a small group of Kale scientists wrote a document that concluded something the Kale had never formally considered, that they had created the conditions for that war, that their dominance had not protected the galaxy. It had pressured it. The species they destroyed had been reacting to a future. They could see clearly even if the Kale could not a future in which there was only one kind of civilization, and it was not theirs. The document was suppressed. Its authors were removed from their positions. But the idea didn't go away, because ideas that are true rarely do. Over the next 1,000 years, the debate grew. Not publicly, never publicly. Inside academies, inside families, inside the long conversations that happen when a civilization is old enough to look backward at itself with clear eyes. And the conclusion, reached slowly and painfully by enough Kale thinkers to eventually tip the balance of their counsel, was this. They had to stop. Not slow down, not reform. Stop, dissolve, give the galaxy back the room that a civilization of their scale was occupying just by existing. The method they chose was the most radical thing any species in recorded history had ever done. They scattered their population across dozens of uninhabited planets, each group seeded with a genetically adjusted version of their own biology, reduced to the earliest stages of development. They suppressed the memories. They erased the records. They left their history behind like a skin and walked away from it into ignorance. The archivist was the one thing they left behind. A caretaker, sealed in a vault, waiting for the day one of the seeded populations found its way back to the stars and came looking. That day was today. Darien sat with all of this for a while. The symbols on Earth, he said finally, the spiral, the markings. The archivist explained. The seeding was not clean. The Kale researchers who designed the program were not robots. They were parents in a sense. They left things, checkpoints. Not enough to reveal the truth prematurely, but enough to leave a thread that a curious enough mind might one day follow. The symbols were distributed across multiple sites on multiple planets, timed to appear in the archaeological record at intervals that a developing civilization would eventually reach. A breadcrumb trail across 30,000 years of human history, pointing toward the stars. Toward here. How many planets were seeded? Darien asked. The archivist gave a number. Darien looked at Una. Una was writing very quickly and not looking up. The number was not 1. It was not even close to 1. The Kale had seeded dozens of worlds, multiple civilizations in the current collective, species that had believed themselves to be entirely native to their home planets for their entire recorded histories, were variants, cousins, all of them in some sense the same people who had once called themselves Kale. Darien understood now why the collective had buried this. He turned to Grath. You knew. The old Veth elder didn't look away. We discovered fragments of it 300 years ago during excavations on Marit 7, enough to understand the shape of the truth. Not all of it, not this. He gestured toward the archivist. We did not know the archivist existed. But you suppressed what you did know. A long pause. We were afraid. Of what? Of what you would become, Grath said. If you knew you were first. Darian looked at the old alien for a moment. There was no anger in it. He was just looking. We're not like the Kale were, Darian said. We lived through the lesson they went back to learn. We were the lesson. He stood up from the floor where he had been sitting and walked to the archivist. I need you to compile everything, he said to it. Every record, every piece of what the Kale left behind. Can you do that? The archivist's answer took a moment. Then it said yes. Somewhere above them, in orbit around Duraz-IV, the collective war fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. 17 ships. And on the bridge of the ESV Relentless, the only human vessel in the system, Admiral Sira Voss looked at her tactical display, counted the contacts, and did not move from her chair. All right, she said to no one in particular. Let's see what we're doing here. Counselor Rail's face on the comm screen had the look of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and was discovering, halfway through, that the other person had not received the script. Admiral Voss, he said, for the third time, I am asking you to withdraw the Relentless from this system. This is a collective internal matter and your presence here is. I heard you the first time, Counselor. Voss leaned back in her chair. She had a habit of looking completely relaxed at moments when everyone around her was not. Her bridge crew had learned to read this as a warning sign rather than reassurance. I acknowledged your request. Acknowledging a request is not the same as complying with one. No, she agreed, it isn't. Rail's expression tightened. He was a collective political figure of the senior tier, which meant he was used to having his preferences treated as events that had already happened. The human admiral sitting in her chair looking at him with calm, attentive eyes was a problem he had not fully prepared for. There are 17 warships in this system, he said. I want to make certain you understand that. I counted 18, actually. One of them is running quiet on the far side of the moon. Lieutenant Bren noticed it on the way back up. Voss tilted her head. But 17 or 18, point taken. You have a lot of ships. She cut the comm. The bridge of the Relentless went quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Lieutenant Bren, at the tactical station, cleared his throat. Admiral, what are we doing? Voss stood up. She was not tall, but she moved like someone who had decided exactly how much space they intended to occupy, and was not adjusting that decision for anyone. She walked to the center of the bridge and looked at the tactical display 17, now confirmed 18, collective warships arranged in a pattern that was professional, and that communicated clearly that they had done this kind of thing before. Open a broadband channel, she said. Not to the fleet, public band, civilian relay network, everything in the sector. The comms officer looked at her. Everything. Every human colony channel, every independent news relay we can hit, every open signal, and patch in the feed from researcher Cole's comm unit on the surface. She looked at the display. He should be getting the archivist's archive together by now. Bren made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. You're going to broadcast it. The moment Darian sends it up, yes. She turned to look at the weapons display. The collective fleet can fire on us. They might, but they can't fire on us and maintain the lie at the same time, not if the whole sector is listening. The broadband channel opened. Voss straightened up and spoke in a clear, even voice that carried none of the drama of the moment, because she had found, in 22 years of command, that the most important things sounded better when you said them plainly. This is Admiral Sira Voss, commanding the Earth Survey vessel Relentless. We are currently positioned in the Duras system, and we are not leaving. In approximately the next hour, we will be transmitting a data archive to every relay station in broadcast range. The archive contains historical records recovered from a sealed vault on Duraz-IV. The vault is approximately 400,000 years old. The records inside it concern the origin of human civilization, and the origin of several other civilizations currently represented in the Interstellar Collective. This information was known in partial form to collective leadership and was deliberately concealed from humanity and from the public record of the collective itself. What we are doing is not a military action. We are not threatening anyone. We are telling the truth. She paused. The collective fleet in this system can stop us if they choose. But I would like to remind the commanders of those 18 vessels that there is a difference between following orders and being the person who fired on a single unarmed human ship for the crime of making a historical announcement. I am not saying that to threaten anyone either. I am saying it because it seems like a useful thing to have clearly on record. She nodded to the comms officer. The channel stayed open. Below the surface of Duraziv, in the circular chamber, Una had finished her translation of the archivist's compression process. The archive was not small. The Kale had been meticulous record keepers in the way that only a civilization facing deliberate self-erasure can be, because when you are choosing to forget everything, you first have to make certain that everything has been written down. The files were dense and cross-referenced, and in a data format that took Una 2 hours to write a conversion script for on the back of her field equipment. Darian sat beside the archivist while she worked. He was not in a hurry. The archivist seemed to understand this, and in the quieter moments, it spoke to him in its slow, careful root language, and he listened to the parts he could understand and let the rest wash over him like music. Grath sat on the other side of the room. At some point, without anyone asking him to, he had dismissed the collective security personnel. They had looked at Orin, and Orin had looked at Grath, and Grath had simply looked back until they left. "I have lived a long time," Grath said after a while. Darian glanced at him. "How long?" 240 of your years. For a Veth, that is middle age." The old alien's voice was rough and tired. "I was part of the team that reviewed the Marit 7 findings. I was not senior then, but I was present when the decision was made to seal the archive. I voted with the majority." Darian didn't say anything. "I have spent 200 years, Grath continued, believing that I did the correct thing, that telling you would make you dangerous, that a humanity which knew it was first would become what the Kale were." He paused. "But you are not what the Kale were. You have been the youngest member of the collective for 80 years, and you have been patient and curious and occasionally very annoying, and not once have you tried to dominate anything." "We tried to dominate each other for a while," Darian said, "back home." "I know, we read your history too." Grath was quiet for a moment. "But you stopped. That is the difference. The Kale never stopped until they had to invent a way to stop from the outside. You found it from the inside." Una looked up. "Ready," she said, "sending to the Relentless." Above, on the bridge of the Relentless, the archive hit the system, and the comms officer opened every relay simultaneously, and the data went out across 14 star systems in the time it took Voss to exhale. 3 collective warships powered their weapons. 15 did not. Voss watched the tactical display. The 3 armed ships held position. They were waiting for an order from Rail. The order came, and Voss heard it on the open channel, and it was brief and clear. The 3 ships did not move. Then, one by one, their weapon signatures went dark, not powered down from the bridge. The readings were wrong for that the power draw dropped in the pattern of a manual shutdown, station by station, like crew members at individual consoles choosing, separately, to stop. Rail's voice on the open channel said something that Voss did not catch, because it was not directed at her, and it was not composed, and it was not the kind of thing a collective senior counselor said on an open channel if he was in control of the situation. Bren turned from his station. "Admiral, 3 of the collective ships are requesting to speak with us." Voss looked at the screen. "Put them through," she said, "all of them." 6 months later, the chamber where the Interstellar Collective Council met was the same room it had always been. The same curved walls, the same arrangement of seats. the same lighting designed to make everyone look slightly more formal than they felt. But there were two empty seats that had not been empty before, and there was one new seat that had not existed before, and the people who sat in that room were not quite the same people who had sat there before the name Durazaivi had become the kind of word that changed conversations. Counselor Rail was not present. His removal had been, by collective standards, rapid. The formal process had taken 11 weeks, which was fast for an institution that measured its decisions in centuries. The informal process had taken about 2 days, which was how long it took for the archive to spread far enough that pretending it hadn't happened was no longer a viable strategy. Darian sat in the visitors' gallery with Una and watched Grath take his seat. The old Veth was not a counselor by title. His title was something that translated awkwardly from the Veth language into either witness or accountable party, depending on how you read the root word. He had requested it himself. It was a position that had no authority and carried only obligation, the obligation to speak plainly about what he knew when speaking plainly was useful. He had argued, in his formal request to the council, that this was the position he should have occupied 200 years ago, and that it was not too late to start. The council had agreed, largely because they were in no position to argue with anything Grath said at the moment. Admiral Voss was already in the chamber. She was not in the visitors' gallery. She had been asked to address the council directly, which was a thing that had happened 11 times in collective history and never before with a human representative. She sat at the floor-level table where speakers usually stood, and she looked comfortable, which was either genuine or a performance of such quality that it didn't matter. The council lead, a Drenathi named Vor whose species had been one of the founding members of the collective, called the session to order and asked Admiral Voss to speak. Voss put her hands flat on the table. "I'm not going to talk about what happened in the Duras system," she said. "You all know what happened. I'm going to talk about what happens next because that's the part that actually matters." She was quiet for a moment. "You spent 300 years afraid of what humanity would do if we found out we were first. That fear made sense if you assumed we were like the kale before their dissolution, and that's a fair assumption, honestly. Most species, given that information, would have used it as a claim, as a justification, as a reason to reorganize the hierarchy with themselves at the top." She looked around the room. "We spent 80 years as your youngest member, your smallest voice. We sat in rooms like this one and we listened more than we talked because we were new and we knew it and we understood that being new means you have more to learn than to teach." She paused. "That's the difference. We completed the lesson the kale couldn't figure out how to pass on except by living it. So did you. So did every species in this room. We all started at the bottom. We all learned. That's not a reason for one of us to be in charge. It's a reason for all of us to know better." The chamber was quiet. Vor said carefully, "You are not claiming precedence. No. You are not asking for a restructured council. You are not asking for revised membership terms. You are not asking for anything. We're asking for honesty going forward," Voss said. "Complete archive access for all member species. No more sealed records on the grounds of political stability. If the truth destabilizes something, the thing it destabilizes probably needed the pressure." Another silence. "That's it?" Vor asked. "That's it." It took 2 more months of negotiation to work out the formal terms, because that was how long honest negotiations took when every side was trying to get something right rather than trying to win. Darian was not involved in those negotiations. He was back on Durazaivi. The site had been declared a protected heritage zone, which meant the collective covered the maintenance costs, and nobody could build anything on the surface within a 5-kilometer radius of the vault entrance. It also meant the dig team got their equipment back, and their data restored, which Una celebrated by spending 3 straight days cataloging the chamber walls with a level of thoroughness that made the collective archive team quietly revise their own documentation standards. The archivist was not moved. Darien had made this a condition of his cooperation with the Council's archive integration project, and it had not been challenged. The archivist stayed where it had always been, in its circular chamber at the bottom of the deepest passage, on the platform the Kale had built for it 500,000 years ago. The only thing different was that the vault door stayed open. On a quiet afternoon near the end of the 6th month, when the site was empty except for the two of them and the low hum of the environmental systems, Darien sat in the chamber alone with the archivist. He had been doing this for 2 or 3 hours most days, working on the language. He was getting better at it. Not fluent. He would never be fluent, but enough to hold a real exchange rather than a translation exercise. He had been thinking about one question for a long time. He had put it off because he wasn't sure he wanted the answer, and then he had put it off because he was afraid the answer would be too large for an ordinary afternoon. But ordinary afternoons were what he had, and he had learned in 19 years of field work that the right time to ask a difficult question was usually slightly earlier than you were comfortable with. "Did the Kale think we would make it?" he asked. The archivist was quiet, not the silence of a machine processing, but the silence of something that was taking the question seriously. Outside the chamber, the red dust of Duraziv drifted over the excavation site, the way it had been drifting for 400,000 years. Then the archivist answered. Darien sat with it for a moment. He looked at the spiral symbol on the wall, not the one on the vault door, but a smaller one, half hidden in the corner of the chamber, that he had found on his 3rd day in this room. He had not reported it in the official documentation. He was keeping it, privately, the way you keep something that belongs to you. He traced it with one finger. Outside, the galaxy was louder than it had been 6 months ago. There were 43 separate ongoing conversations happening across the collective that had not been possible before the archive was released, because those conversations required a shared foundation of truth that hadn't existed before. Some of those conversations were uncomfortable. Some of them were changing things that had been settled for centuries. A handful of species were going through something that looked, from the outside, like the particular kind of difficulty that happens when you find out the story you have been telling about yourself has a chapter you didn't know about. It was, Darien thought, exactly the kind of discomfort that meant things were actually moving, not the false calm of a secret kept, the real and effortful motion of people who knew the truth and were deciding what to do with it. He stood up. He dusted off his knees in the habitual way of someone who has spent years kneeling in excavation sites. He picked up his field notebook, tucked it under his arm, and looked at the archivist one more time. The archivist had said they hoped. That was enough to begin. Apparently, it was enough to finish. Darien walked out of the chamber, up through the passage, and out into the red afternoon air of Duraziv. Behind him, the vault door stayed open. It had waited 500,000 years. It had not waited in vain.